It didn't start in Washington or Moscow. It began in the dusty skies of Ouagadougou. On an ordinary morning, families walking to the market, children chasing each other to school, suddenly froze as they looked up. Cutting silently across the African sky was a shape they had never seen before. Sleek, ghost-like, almost invisible. It was not a drone. It was not the familiar silhouette of an old French helicopter. It was something else, something that whispered of power. A Su-57. For the people of Burkina Faso, it was a glimpse of a new era. For generals in Brussels and Washington, it was a nightmare report crossing their desks. Because this was not just about one jet. This was about what it symbolized: a young African leader, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, daring to stand shoulder to shoulder with Vladimir Putin and opening the door for Russia's most advanced stealth fighter to patrol African skies. Think about what that means. For decades, America's F-16s ruled the skies uncontested. They were the stamp of Western dominance, the reassurance that no power could challenge NATO's presence. But what happens when a jet designed to slip through radars to outmaneuver and outgun begins to appear over Africa? What happens when Africa itself becomes the proving ground for a contest between old empires and rising nations? This is not just a military story. It's about sovereignty, dignity, and the question of whether Africa will forever remain under someone else's shadow, or whether it will carve its own path in the 21st century. So I ask you, do you believe that President Ibrahim Traoré's bold gamble, inviting Su-57s into Africa, is the key to finally breaking NATO's grip, or will it ignite a larger fire that even Burkina Faso cannot contain? Please share if you feel that you are one of the first to witness this historic shift. Subscribe if you believe the truth is more important than the headlines. The story begins not in the skies, but in the quiet corridors of power in Ouagadougou. Since taking office, Captain Ibrahim Traoré has spoken of one thing above all else: sovereignty. For him, sovereignty is not just a slogan, not just a word to be repeated at international summits. It is something practical, something visible, something that can be touched and seen. And nowhere is sovereignty tested more fiercely than in the air. Whoever commands the skies commands the future. That is why in the summer of 2025, whispers began to circulate about a military cooperation agreement unlike anything Africa had ever seen. Traoré had not only invited Russian instructors into Burkina Faso to train soldiers and secure borders. He had gone further, much further. He had opened the door to Russia's crown jewel, the Su-57 stealth fighter, a fifth-generation jet designed to rival and defeat America's most celebrated planes. For decades, NATO had treated Africa as a safe backyard, a space where old F-16s and French Mirage fighters could dominate uncontested. But the Su-57 represented something else entirely. With its radar-absorbing skin, its powerful engines capable of supercruise, and its deadly arsenal of beyond-visual-range missiles, this aircraft was a symbol that Africa would no longer accept second-hand protection. It was a declaration that the balance of power could shift. Traoré's government framed the move not as an act of aggression, but as an act of defense. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, the nations of the Sahel Alliance, have been targeted by terrorist groups, destabilized by covert operations, and undermined by decades of foreign interference. If Europe could send thousands of troops, if America could station drones, why could Africa not seek its own shield? Why could an African leader not demand the very best for his people? In Moscow, Vladimir Putin saw an opportunity. The Su-57 was more than a weapon. It was a geopolitical message. By aligning with Traoré, Putin could signal to the West that Russia's reach was not confined to Ukraine or the Arctic. It stretched into Africa, into the very heart of NATO's traditional sphere of influence. And unlike in Eastern Europe here, the people themselves were cheering. Crowds filled the streets in Ouagadougou, carrying posters of Traoré and chanting slogans of independence. The sight of a Russian jet circling above was not met with fear, but with applause. Western intelligence agencies noticed. Reports filtered back to Washington satellite images showing Russian cargo planes unloading equipment at Burkina Faso airstrips. European newspapers speculated about African bases for Russian stealth fighters. NATO analysts quietly admitted that in a head-to-head confrontation, the Su-57's stealth and agility could neutralize the older F-16s deployed by America and its allies. And if even one squadron of these jets was stationed in Africa, it could lock down vast regions of airspace from the Sahara to the Gulf of Guinea. The symbolism was almost as powerful as the technology. For decades, Africa had been seen as a theater where others played their games. America and Europe supplied weapons-trained officers and dictated who could or could not be in charge. But Ibrahim Traoré flipped that script. Here was an African leader not begging for aid, not asking for outdated machinery, but directly negotiating for cutting-edge defense systems and receiving them. To his supporters, this was proof that Burkina Faso was no longer a pawn. To his critics, it was a reckless gamble inviting great power confrontation onto African soil. Yet even they could not deny what had happened. The balance of perception had shifted. No longer was Africa viewed as defenseless. It was now the stage for a contest that even the Pentagon had to take seriously. And so with each flight of the Su-57, whether real or rumored, a question echoed in both Ouagadougou and Washington: has Africa finally found the weapon that makes NATO hesitate? The tension reached its peak not in Ouagadougou, but in Brussels, where NATO officials gathered behind closed doors. Maps of Africa were spread across polished wooden tables dotted with red and blue markers. Military analysts whispered the same fear if even a small squadron of Russian Su-57s became operational in the Sahel. NATO's traditional dominance over African skies would be shattered. For decades, the American-made F-16 had been the workhorse of Western air power. Sleek, fast, and reliable, it had seen combat in nearly every corner of the world. But the F-16 was born in the 1970s. Its design was rooted in an era before stealth, before radar-absorbing composites, before infrared suppression systems. By contrast, the Su-57 was engineered for the future. It could evade detection strike from beyond visual range and even perform maneuvers that seemed to defy physics. This wasn't just a theoretical contest. NATO wargamed the scenario. In simulation after simulation, F-16 squadrons struggled to detect the Su-57 until it was too late. Pilots admitted off the record that you can't fight what you can't see. Even if NATO poured billions into upgrades, the truth was undeniable. The skies of Africa might no longer belong to the West. News of the partnership between Traore and Putin rippled across the world. In Moscow, state television framed it as a triumph: Russia's technology standing guard over a rising Africa. In Ouagadougou, the streets lit up with fireworks and chants of sovereignty now. Young men painted the silhouette of a Su-57 on their motorcycles. Women in the markets told foreign journalists, if they fear our skies, maybe they will finally respect our land. But in Washington, the mood was anything but celebratory. A classified Pentagon memo leaked to the press warned of a new strategic front in Africa. Senators appeared on television demanding answers. Are we going to let Russia plant stealth jets in our backyard? One asked angrily. Military contractors saw opportunity. They lobbied for contracts to send more drones, more radars, more bases. The defense industry smelled profit, but behind the noise was a deeper panic. America's aura of invincibility was cracking. European capitals reacted with equal unease. In Paris, officials remembered the humiliating withdrawal of French troops from Mali and Burkina Faso. Now, to see Russian jets welcomed where French forces had been rejected cut deep into France's pride. Germany's defense minister admitted, if we lose the skies of Africa, we lose the continent. British tabloids screamed headlines, Putin's ghost fighters haunt Africa. And then came the symbolic high point, a joint parade in Ouagadougou, where Burkina soldiers marched side by side with Russian officers. Overhead, a low-flying aircraft streaked across the sky, its sleek body glinting in the sun. Whether it was truly a Su-57 or a carefully staged illusion hardly mattered. For the people, it was real. For NATO, it was terrifying. The climax of this confrontation was not a battle but a perception. Power is not only measured by missiles and radars, but by the fear it inspires and the confidence it gives. For the first time, NATO officials were forced to consider the possibility that their forces could be denied access to African skies. For the first time, Africans felt that their leaders were not passive recipients of second-hand protection, but active players rewriting the rules. And so, as the world watched, the story of the Su-57 in Burkina Faso became more than military hardware. It became a symbol of defiance, a warning shot across the bow of Western dominance. And it left an open question, echoing in the chambers of NATO headquarters. If they could lose the skies of Africa, what else might they lose next? The roar of the Su-57 may have been faint in the skies, but on the ground its echo carried into every corner of Burkina Faso society. For ordinary citizens, the possibility of Russian stealth fighters circling above was more than a military upgrade. It was a psychological shield. Mothers in Ouagadougou spoke of finally sleeping without fear of foreign drones buzzing overhead. Farmers in the Sahel countryside, long terrorized by cross-border raids and shadowy militias, began to say, "At last our skies are ours." This sense of pride translated quickly into politics. Ibrahim Traoré's popularity surged to unprecedented levels. Crowds filled city squares holding placards of jets alongside his portrait, chanting that sovereignty had at last taken flight. For a leader often portrayed in the West as inexperienced or reckless, the symbolism of standing shoulder to shoulder with Russia's most advanced military technology transformed him into something larger, a symbol of Africa's defiance. But the ripple effects were not limited to Burkina Faso. Across the Sahel Alliance, leaders in Mali and Niger read the signals clearly. If Traoré could negotiate for stealth aircraft, what was stopping them from securing similar agreements? Joint defense councils of the AES bloc began discussing integrated air defense radar sharing and even the potential of an African-operated stealth squadron. Suddenly, the Sahel was no longer a collection of vulnerable states begging for foreign protection. It was becoming a bloc with teeth, and the world took notice. Inside NATO, the political fallout was sharp. European lawmakers demanded explanations for how they had lost Africa so rapidly. The French opposition mocked President Macron for letting former colonies slip into Russia's embrace. In Brussels, debates over budget allocations turned bitter. Some argued for deploying more Western jets to the region. Others warned that such a move risked escalation and humiliation. In Washington, the conversation turned partisan. Hawks in Congress called for reasserting American air dominance, while others questioned whether pouring billions into African skies served U.S. taxpayers at all. One senator asked bluntly, "Are we going to create another Ukraine, this time in the Sahel?" The political divide grew wider, but beneath the rhetoric was a sobering realization: the old assumption of automatic superiority no longer held. Meanwhile, African civil society found its voice. Intellectual student groups and religious leaders began framing the arrival of the Su-57 not simply as military hardware, but as a metaphor for dignity. "For decades, we were told we could only fly with borrowed wings," a professor in Bamako remarked. "Now we are building wings of our own." The sense of empowerment stirred debates about democracy, sovereignty, and what true independence should look like in the 21st century. Of course, not everyone welcomed the development. Human rights groups inside Burkina Faso worried that deeper ties with Russia could entrench authoritarian practices. Some opposition politicians argued that Traoré was risking too much, dragging the nation into great power rivalries beyond its control. Yet even critics struggled to ignore the raw enthusiasm on the streets. For ordinary Burkinabe, this was the first time in living memory that global powers were not dictating their skies, they were negotiating with them. The political consequences were undeniable. Traoré's stature grew beyond Burkina Faso's borders. He was no longer just a transitional leader, he was the face of a continental shift. And the question hanging in the air was no longer whether Africa could defend itself, but whether the West was prepared to accept an Africa that refused to bow. In Washington, the mood was tense. For decades, Africa had been an afterthought in American foreign policy, a place for aid programs, counter-terrorism bases, and occasional speeches about democracy. But the idea of Russian Su-57s in African skies jolted the establishment awake. The Pentagon convened emergency sessions, intelligence briefings filled the White House Situation Room, and the question at the center of it all was chillingly simple: have we lost Africa? For U.S. military planners, the nightmare was obvious. The F-16, once considered untouchable, suddenly looked outdated. Generals admitted privately that putting American pilots up against Russian stealth fighters in the Sahel would be a gamble. Losing even one dogfight would not just be a tactical setback, it would be a humiliation broadcast across the globe. The image of American power carefully cultivated for generations could be shattered by a single explosion in African skies. Politically, the debate turned fierce. Republicans accused the Biden administration of sleepwalking into another Cold War, while Democrats warned that reckless escalation could draw the U.S. into yet another costly conflict far from home. Talk show hosts asked whether America should really be risking blood and treasure in a region where public opinion was increasingly anti-Western. The American public, weary of wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, seemed reluctant to support any new adventures. Across the Atlantic, European leaders were just as unsettled. Paris still stung by its expulsion from Burkina Faso, and Mali saw the Su-57 as a personal insult. French newspapers called it the ghost of colonial defeat. In Berlin, policymakers worried that NATO unity was fraying, that while some nations demanded a stronger response, others preferred to ignore the Sahel entirely. Britain's tabloids never subtle-splashed sensational headlines: Putin's jets stalk Africa. Meanwhile, Moscow celebrated. Russian state media aired triumphant footage of cheering crowds in Ouagadougou, framing it as proof that the global south was rejecting Western dominance. China, though less vocal, watched closely, calculating how a weakened NATO presence in Africa might open new doors for its own economic influence. Beijing did not need to supply jets, it only needed to wait and invest where the West retreated. Other African nations took careful note. Leaders in Ghana, Ghana, Senegal, and South Africa debated quietly: should they distance themselves from Traoré's bold move, or should they prepare for a future where Western protection was no longer guaranteed? The African Union found itself divided, some applauding Burkina Faso's defiance, others warning of great power rivalry turning the continent into a battlefield once more. But perhaps the most profound impact was symbolic. Around the world, commentators began asking questions that would have been unthinkable only a few years ago. Could NATO actually be outmaneuvered? Could America's technological dominance be challenged by a small African state standing with Moscow? The very act of asking those questions showed how far the balance of perception had shifted. For America and Europe, the sight of Su-57s in Africa was not just about jets. It was about losing the narrative, losing influence, and facing the unsettling truth that Africa was no longer content to play the role of a passive stage for foreign powers. Under Ibrahim Traoré, it had become an actor in its own right, and that terrified the West. The story of Su-57s in Africa is about far more than metal engines and radar. It is about the meaning of power in a world that is shifting beneath our feet. For NATO and the United States, the possibility of Russian stealth fighters patrolling the skies of the Sahel is not just a tactical challenge, it is a strategic warning. It shows that Africa, once treated as a chessboard for outside powers, is no longer content to remain silent. For the people of Burkina Faso, the symbolism is profound. Under Captain Ibrahim Traoré, a nation that once depended on foreign troops to secure its borders now dares to imagine defending itself with the most advanced technology in the world. That sense of pride cannot be measured in dollars or missiles. It is measured in dignity, in the ability to look up at the sky and believe it belongs to you. Yet with this pride comes danger. The entry of Su-57s into Africa is not a story without risks. History reminds us that whenever small nations acquire the means to challenge empires, the empires rarely stay quiet. NATO may hesitate today, but what happens tomorrow? Could Burkina Faso and its allies be dragged into a proxy war? Could Africa become the next front line of a global confrontation between East and West? These are questions that every African and indeed every American must wrestle with. For viewers in the United States, the lesson is also sobering. For decades, Washington believed it could control the tempo of world events. But sovereignty is contagious. When one nation dares to stand up, whether in Asia, Latin America, or Africa, others take notice. And when those nations begin to form alliances, when they start questioning the old rules, the world changes in ways that no Pentagon plan can fully contain. So the real question is not only about jets, it is about the future. Will Africa be allowed to chart its own course, or will it be forced back into the shadows of foreign dominance? Can President Ibrahim Traoré's gamble with Russia secure freedom, or will it set the stage for new conflict? I leave that question with you. Do you think that President Ibrahim Traoré's national reform strategies, including this bold military partnership, are truly effective, or do they risk dragging Africa into a larger storm? Please share if you feel that you are one of the first to know about and support President Ibrahim Traoré. Subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines. And tell us in the comments, can we continue to trust President Ibrahim Traoré, or should someone else carry his vision forward? Because what happens in the skies of Burkina Faso will not remain there. It is the opening act of a drama that could reshape the balance of power, not only in Africa, but across the world.